If you think a nightmare announces itself, Ipswich will correct you. It came in small, ordinary ways at first. A missed call, a friend who didn't show, a mother sitting by the window longer than usual. Then it arrived all at once, on the water, in the woods, along the cold margins of a dual carriageway, until a town that prided itself on being quiet learned how loud fear can be. This story begins at the tail end of 2006, when the nights were getting long and the London Road red light area was still busy after dark. Ipswich was a port and a market town. It wasn't supposed to be a headline. But for women working the streets, most of them there because drugs make tomorrow too expensive to reach, routine was already a negotiation with risk. Taxis prowled, cars slowed, and familiar faces kept each other in sight because sometimes that's the only safety available. The first absence was Tanya Nicole, just 19. She was small, fast-talking, and stubborn about hope in the way only teenagers can be. Late on October 30th, she vanished into the town's glow and didn't come home. At first, there were messages, calls, the usual web of friends and family trying to stitch the day back together. But the days began to stack. Tanya's mother, who thought her daughter worked at a bar or a salon, learned a truth no parent wants delivered by police. Missing notices went up anyway. You always pretend there's still time. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Gemma Adams, 25, last seen in the small hours of November 14th near West End Road. Gemma had grown up nearby, drifted into the street to fund a habit that had become its own gravity, and still managed to hold on to a softness her friends talked about later, with the kind of smile that breaks at the edges. She didn't come back either. The red light area suddenly felt colder. The women out there started pairing up more deliberately, warning one another about cars that didn't look right, drivers who stared too long, routes that felt wrong. The police presence grew in the background, marked cars cruising, unmarked ones listening, because two missing women from the same small world is never just a coincidence. For 3 brittle weeks, Ipswich held its breath. Then December arrived, and with it, the water. On December 2nd, a man working near Belstead Brook, a quiet ribbon of water just outside town, saw something that pulled the ordinary out of his hands and threw it away. The body of a young woman lay in the stream, naked, cradled by the slow current as if the water had been asked to keep a secret. It was Gemma. There were no signs of sexual assault, no immediate story written on the skin, only the impossible fact of her. The murder inquiry began because it had to. The name Operation Sumac went up on whiteboards and on the wall of a control room that would not sleep properly for the next 2 weeks. 8 days later, another discovery snapped the town's nerves. December 8th, Copdock Mill, southwest of Ipswich, where water idles in black pools under the hedgerows. Divers moved with that quiet urgency the job teaches you. They surfaced with the second absence now made visible. Tanya. 19 years old in a brook on a winter morning. The careful language of press conferences. We are linking these cases. We urge women to stay off the streets. We are putting significant resources into the investigation. Couldn't compete with what people were feeling in kitchens and cars, terror, anger, and the helplessness that grows when you realize the danger isn't a rumor. It's a person. The police did what you do when the facts outrun the clock. They pulled officers from other forces. They built timelines with pins and string, then rebuilt them digitally so nothing got lost. Plainclothes units drifted through London Road trying to be invisible while also being seen. Uniformed patrols made themselves obvious to Dieter whoever was hunting. Detectives looked for patterns in CCTV, phone traffic, familiar cars, and the small pieces, fibers, soil, paint, that travel with a killer, whether he knows it or not. It wasn't enough to stop what came next. On December 10th, a couple walking near Nacton, by a strip of woodland close to the A14, stumbled across a sight no one forgets. A young woman's body lay in the open, naked, placed rather than thrown, her arms arranged away from her sides. It was Annalie Alderton, 24. The post-mortem would say asphyxiation. The police would later confirm she was about 3 months pregnant. The arrangement of her body suggested someone wanted to be understood, or to frighten. Either way, the line between private killing and public message had been crossed. If fear is a contagion, Ipswich became an outbreak zone that week. The red light area emptied and filled in cycles as women chose between the immediate need for money and the longer fear of becoming a headline. Television trucks arrived and parked by metal railings that had only ever known football traffic and school runs. National papers sent their best and worst habits, patient reporting, and cheap nicknames. People compared the speed and setting to older horrors, as if analogy could blunt this one. It got worse, fast. December 12th, early afternoon. Near Levington, only a short drive from where Annalie had been found, a passing motorist noticed a shape 20 feet off the old Felixstowe Road, pale against scrub. Officers moved in and found Paula Clennell, 24. She had spoken on camera days earlier about how the killings made her wary, but she was still out there because withdrawal waits for no one, and rent doesn't understand police warnings. A police helicopter searching the same patch of land picked up another form nearby. That was Annette Nichols, 29. Later examinations could not fix a precise cause of death for her, but the message was clear. The killer knew the terrain, the routes, the timings, and he was getting faster. 5 women in 11 December days. 2 found in water. 3 left on land near roads everyone in Suffolk knows by muscle memory. No sexual assault, no clothing. Asphyxiation confirmed in at least 2 cases. The kind of facts that make you shiver not just because they are grim, but because they suggest someone disciplined, someone who understands visibility and risk, someone who is practiced. Detectives stood before cameras and tried to turn panic into tasks, appeal for dashcam sightings before dashcams were common, ask drivers to recall a Mondeo or a van, push anyone who had seen anything on London Road to speak now. Meanwhile, in the control room, the map lit up with pins that wouldn't stop multiplying. Last sightings, body locations, witness mentions, number plates that felt wrong. Telephone pings that cut across fields and hedges in lines you could draw with a ruler. You can measure the size of a case by what it steals from a town in real time. Ipswich lost its night first. People stayed in. Then it lost its rhythm. School runs and shift changes got a police escort. Finally, it lost its patience for euphemism. Reporters tried Suffolk Strangler, and locals grimaced because headlines don't have to live with echoes. Parents learned to explain to children why there were so many uniforms without handing them the details. Women who had never stood in the red light area still felt the threat in their bones, because the boundary between those streets and my street had just been erased. By mid-December, the murder squad had a name for itself, Operation Sumac, and a focus that narrowed by the hour. The victimology was clear. 5 women connected to the same small economy, all last seen in or around the same streets, all recovered within a few miles of one another. Somewhere in that overlap lived a man who thought he could hunt without being seen. Somewhere in that overlap, the threads he couldn't help but shed, DNA, fibers, soil, a pattern he didn't notice he was repeating, were already waiting to be found. The next chapter belongs to that hunt, the door knocks, the searches, the arrests, the moment a nondescript house near the red light strip became the center of a country's attention. But for part 1, let the focus stay where it belongs, on Tanya, Gemma, Annalie, Paula, and Annette. 5 names a town learned to say together. 5 lives that should still be in the world. 5 families who would spend that Christmas learning how to breathe again. The water had given up 2 women. The woods and scrub beside the A14 had given up 3 more. Ipswich understood in the bleak way towns learn things that this wasn't a mystery to savor. It was a clock. The investigation, Operation Sumac, moved like a machine that had finally been given its purpose. Stop whoever was doing this before another family got a call in the middle of the night. Detectives split the work the way good teams do. One group built timelines so dense they looked like weaving. Last sightings on London Road, phone pings from towers along the southern edge of town, ANPR hits on plates running into and out of the red light strip, CCTV grabs from filling stations and shop fronts that never imagined their cameras would be this important. Another group lived in the field, door knocking, asking the same quiet questions again and again, mapping who knew whom in a world where everyone knew everyone. A third group, the forensics people, worked the margins, where killers leave what they don't know they're leaving: fibers, soil, paint, and the microscopic biology that doesn't care if a man thinks he's careful. Uniformed policing shifted shape too. High-visibility patrols tried to make London Road unwelcoming to predators and welcoming to witnesses. Plainclothes officers blended in where blending was the only way to hear what mattered. Outreach teams offered women lifts out, health checks, phones, condoms, and the maddening necessary conversation every hour. If you must work, work together. If a car feels wrong, don't get in. If you can, go home. The appeals went national. Detectives took a podium and spoke with the tone professionals use when they're trying to keep panic from curdling into paralysis. We are linking these murders. We believe the person responsible is local or very familiar with this area. We need information about vehicles, family saloons, estates, taxis, seen in and around London Road, Nacton, Levington, Copdock, and Felixstowe Road. We are particularly interested in anyone known to frequent the red light area who has recently changed their routines. The phones lit up. Some calls were noise, some were cruel, some were the kind that move a case 1 square forward on the board. Among the voices was a man who talked too freely to reporters, Tom Stevens, a supermarket worker from nearby, known in the scene as a regular client, eager for attention, interviewed on television as if proximity could stand in for insight. He described the women, their risks, the streets at night, and himself. Detectives listened to his interviews the way you listen to someone who wants to be in the story. On December 18th, they arrested him on suspicion of murder. The point wasn't theater. It was thoroughness. You cannot leave a question mark that big untested. While Stevens was interviewed, house and digital searches began. Forensic screens ran. Quietly, the evidence failed to bend towards him. The next morning, December 19th, Operation Sumac made the move that would change the wall of faces in the control room. Officers went to a terraced house on London Road, only a short walk from where the women had worked. The tenant was Steve Wright, 48, a shift worker, at that time a forklift driver at the port of Felixstowe, with a tidy front, an ordinary face, and a life threaded tightly through the streets the victims walked. He lived with his partner. He kept irregular hours. He drove a dark Ford Mondeo that several women had mentioned in passing to friends in those quick, essential safety briefings. Blue-black Mondeo, middle-aged driver, knows the roads. The arrest was calm because that's how the best work is done. A front door opened. A man was let out. On the road, the Mondeo was seized and trailered away under a cover. Scenes of crime officers stepped into a house that would soon be labeled not just address and postcode, but exhibit. They worked through the place like librarians handling a rare book. Rugs, upholstery, clothing, a jacket, shoes, the boot liner of the car, the wheel wells where vegetation and soil lodge like signatures. Every item was bagged, barcoded, logged, and sent into a pipeline where scientists with practiced patience waited to translate dust into narrative. Why write? Not one thing, many. The geography was eloquent. He lived on the route the women used, drove the roads where bodies were found, and worked hours that made predation easier. The behavioral picture, steady partner, cash-in-hand economy, familiarity with the red light area, looked unremarkable until you placed it over the map of 5 murders. Then it looked like proximity masquerading as normal. The witness material helped. Comments about a Mondeo and a quiet man, CCTV frames of a similar car near the relevant stretches at night. ANPR reads that didn't prove murder but proved opportunity. And slowly, the most unforgiving pieces began to arrive from the lab. Fibers that shouldn't be on victims and were. Minute DNA traces that shouldn't be in a car and were. Soil and plant matter that spoke the dialect of the very places where the bodies had been laid. Out on the streets, women clocked the arrest before the evening bulletins did. Word moves differently in communities that survive by passing information hand to hand. London Road thinned, even more than it already had. Some of the regulars went home because the tiny wedge of safety had widened. Others waited for the official confirmation of what they dared to hope, that the run of discoveries was over. Inside the incident room, the board changed color. Names of the 5 women, Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, Annette Nichols, stayed where they were, anchored by grief and purpose. Around them, the pins began to stack under a single heading. Detectives who had held sleep lightly for weeks allowed themselves a first breath that didn't feel like rationing air. But the tone stayed disciplined. One arrest isn't proof. The only way to earn the weight of 5 funerals is with a case that can carry it. The search is expanded, workplaces, lockups, anywhere a man might clean a car without being seen. Forensic light sources combed through upholstery fibers like combs through hair. Vacuum samples lifted particles that would later sing in the lab. The Mondeo gave up what cars always give up to the patient, an archive of where they've been and who they've carried. The house gave up something houses always give up, a private palette of fibers no other building has in the same proportion. Carpet blends, sofa throws, bedroom textiles that become, under a microscope, as individual as a face. While the scientists worked, detectives kept one eye on the calendar and the other on the town. Christmas was a week away. 5 families were selecting coffins instead of presents. Ipswich's civic life had to find words that didn't feel insulting. Churches held vigils that were pointed, not pious. The mayor spoke about dignity and resolve. The police kept shifting officers across sectors to reassure without relaxing. The press camped by the cordon on London Road and by the turning for Levington, working in low winter light and rehearsing a form of restraint the story demanded. On paper, 2 men were under arrest within 24 hours of each other. In reality, the case had begun to orbit one of them. Stevens would be released on bail while inquiries continued. Over the following days, attention drifted away from his interviews and back to the evidence. Wright remained in custody while detectives staged the slow, careful presentation of scientific results that prosecutors require before they will stake a trial on them. Behind the scenes, the CPS advised, as it always does in major cases, on framing the facts into charges that would survive the courtroom. A decision point came fast because the case had moved fast. Within days, Wright was charged with the murders of all 5 women. The announcement landed with the sober weight the town needed. Not triumph, not closure, just the next honest step. He was remanded in custody. A preliminary hearing put dates into a calendar that had been chaos. The forensic work didn't stop. It sharpened. Each victim would be linked to the defendant by a different set of strands: fibers, trace DNA, vehicle transfers, route analysis, so that no single doubt could swallow the whole. That is where the manhunt ends and the legal story begins. The next part belongs to the evidence in detail, the carpets that traveled, the microscopic threads that turned 5 separate discoveries into one trail, the cameras and number plate hits that mapped night movements, and the way prosecutors arranged those pieces so a jury could carry them without dropping a single one. Before we go there, hold the names again because the point of all this machinery is simple. Tanya, Gemma, Annalie, Paula, Annette. Operation Sumac didn't exist to be impressive. It existed to speak for them. Big cases are won in small rooms. While Ipswich tried to sleep through a December that wouldn't end, the investigation moved from Fields and Brooks into labs and interview suites. The man at the center of it, Steve Wright 48, sat on remand. The work now was to turn fear into proof. Start with the Mondeo. Cars keep diaries they don't mean to. Under seats and in mats, in wheel arches and trunk linings, a vehicle carries the history of who and where. Forensic teams stripped Wright's car down to its quiet parts and collected the debris of ordinary life. Textile fibers, plant fragments, minute skin cells that no one notices until a microscope makes them loud. The same meticulous harvest happened inside his house on London Road. Every carpet, throw, cushion, towel, a private palette of threads and blends, was logged and bagged. Then the matching began. On each woman, Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, Annette Nichols, forensic scientists found mixed sets of fibers that didn't belong where they were. Combinations that spoke of a particular car and a particular home. A rare blend from a car seat turned up on a victim's hair. A household textile signature showed on a body recovered in Woodland. No single strand could carry a case. The pattern could. The odds of the same cocktail of fibers appearing on 5 separate victims by chance shrank to vanishing. The lab built charts that looked like constellations, each point a thread type, each line a match, until 5 separate skies resolved into the same night. Alongside the fiber work came trace biology. This wasn't a case with cinematic DNA moments. Water had washed away stories from 2 scenes. Winter had starved others of easy answers. But science rarely leaves with empty hands. Swabs from within the Mondeo, low-level DNA mixtures on fabrics, and a few minute traces on items recovered from Wright's address formed a second, quieter layer of linkage. On their own, they were whispers. With the fibers, they became chorus. Map work gave the science a spine. Detectives leaned hard on CCTV and ANPR, the number plate cameras that don't forget. Frames showed a dark Ford Mondeo using routes that mattered at times that mattered. The slip roads by Nacton and Levington, the turns near Copdock, the loops any local would take to drift from London Road to the quieter margins where bodies were left. Phone records added rhythm. Cell sites registering a handset moving in concert with those roads on relevant nights. None of it shouted. All of it pointed. Meanwhile, in interview, Wright did what defendants often do when evidence starts to sketch a silhouette. He admitted proximity and denied everything else. Yes, he knew the area. He lived on London Road. Yes, he had used sex workers. That was not a crime. Yes, his car had been seen. He worked nights and drove a lot. The women? He shook his head. He hadn't killed anyone. Like all denials, the account asked the room to believe that chance had stacked 5 coincidences into a single life. Investigators didn't argue. They just kept building. The post-mortems set the hard boundaries. Asphyxiation was confirmed for Annalie Alderton. Paula Clennell showed signs consistent with neck compression. Annette Nichols' cause of death could not be firmly fixed, but the evidence pointed the same way. For Gemma and Tanya, the water pared the story down to what could survive immersion. Precise causes were unascertained, but there were no injuries inconsistent with the pattern, and the context bound them to the others. The absence of sexual assault across the 5 was telling. It narrowed motive into a colder place and strengthened the impression of control rather than chaos. When prosecutors joined the table, they asked two questions that matter in cases built from parts. First, does each victim have independent support? Second, do those strands interlock so that taking one away doesn't collapse the rest? Operation Sumac's answer was to layer the proof. For one woman, the headline link would be the Mondeo fibers and route data. For another, household textiles and a time window. For a third, a phone pattern and a particular trace fragment. Juries don't convict on vibes. They convict on weight distributed well enough that no single doubt can carry the load. Back in town, the violence had forced an awful kind of stillness into the holidays. Families planned funerals. Vigils blurred into carols. A Christmas market tried to feel normal beneath helicopter passes that still happened out of habit. The police fronted the cameras with deliberate understatement. A man was charged. The investigation was ongoing. Officers were still in the field. Anyone with information should come forward. Behind the composure was a simple resolve. Take this cleanly into court. By the time winter turned toward a new year, the case file looked like an atlas. One section mapped London Road, who saw whom, which cars clients and workers mentioned, the businesses whose cameras had been persuaded to give up their archives. Another section mapped the recovery sites, Belstead Brook, Copdock Mill, the Nacton and Levington Woodland, each with its own forensic biography. Typical soil composition, common vegetation, the peculiarities that let a lab say, this seed, this dust, this sand grain makes sense here and not there. A third section cross-referenced shifts at the port of Felixstowe, partner alibis, cash withdrawals, and fuel stops. Because the ordinary spending of a life often leaves timestamps a killer forgets about when he's trying to be clever. The charging decision, 5 counts of murder, landed with the sober tone the moment required. Wright was remanded. Hearing dates were set at Ipswich Crown Court. The defense team, seasoned, professional, signaled the position you'd expect. Not guilty to all counts. Challenge the forensics, challenge the timelines, humanize proximity, and seed the jury with alternate interpretations. Contamination risk, transfer without homicide, innocent contact in a world where contact happens. So the prosecution sharpened its teaching plan. A good forensic trial is a class with an exam at the end. The scientists would explain, in ordinary language, how fibers travel and how combinations become significant. They would anticipate the defense's 2 best moves: secondary transfer, fibers hopping from place to place, and laboratory contamination, and show how controls and statistics fenced those specters out. The mapping officers would teach the jury to read CCTV the way detectives do, not as single images, but as chains. This frame here, that plate there, this clock time offset. The overlaps that build a movement picture you can trust. The pathologists would be careful and spare. Juries don't need adjectives. They need mechanisms and consistencies that fit the shape of 5 deaths. If there was a single human hinge in the Crown's case, it was familiarity masquerading as chance. Wright lived on the street where the women worked. He drove the very routes where bodies were found. He kept hours that overlapped with the victim's last sightings. He used the same economy. He blended. Cases collapse when a jury can picture 2 different people plausibly making the same choices. Operation Sumac's entire strategy was to make that picture impossible. In the background, the women whose lives had mapped this case stayed at the center of the file. Each had a biography that refused to be reduced to the job she did to survive. Tanya joked like she was older than 19. Gemma wrote lists of good intentions and tried to keep them. Annalie was pregnant and still spoke about tomorrow. Paula had warned on camera about risk and gone out anyway because withdrawal is louder than fear. Annette mothered friends twice her size. The police kept their names on the incident room wall to remind everyone why meticulousness mattered. By the time spring calendars began to set, the path to trial was clear. The defense would say presence without murder, contamination, coincidence. The Crown would say proximity plus pattern plus science equals certainty. And 12 people would be asked to spend weeks learning how to listen to threads and pixels and timetables until the only reasonable story left standing was the one no one in Ipswich wanted to be true. Courtrooms don't run on fear. They run on proof. When Steve Wright was brought to Ipswich Crown Court in early 2008, the charge sheet had 5 names that the town already knew by heart: Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, Annette Nichols, and a promise from the prosecution that ordinary pieces, layered carefully, would tell an extraordinary truth. The opening didn't thunder. It ticked. The Crown walked the jury back through routes and times, CCTV frames and ANPR hits, shift records, fuel receipts, and the geography of a man whose habits overlapped again and again with the last movements of 5 women. Then came the science, fibers first. A senior forensic scientist took the stand and taught a class in how threads travel, from car seat to coat, from house throw to hair, from one closed space to another. Not one fiber, the witness said, combinations. Unique cocktails of household and automotive fibers that recurred across victims, the Mondeo, and Wright's home in proportions that made coincidence a fantasy. The defense rose on the word transfer. Fibers are social creatures, counsel suggested. They hitch rides. Couldn't a thread from a common car fabric or a cheap throw end up anywhere? The answer arrived calmly. Control samples, population studies, and rarer fibers that anchored the case. It was not one cheap blue thread turning up where it shouldn't. It was patterns, household blends in the same ratios, the same automotive set again and again, on women recovered from Belstead Brook, Copdock Mill, and the Nacton-Levington margins. Secondary transfer and contamination were addressed before they could bloom into reasonable doubt. Procedures, blanks, blind tests, the lab's own internal audits. This wasn't a single spectacular match. It was statistical weight built brick by brick. Map witnesses followed. A detective took the jury through CCTV as story rather than snapshots. A dark Mondeo passing a fixed point at 01:14. The same plate caught by ANPR minutes later on a feeder road that leads, if you're local, to the same stretches where bodies were found. The screens weren't cinematic. They were repetitive. And repetition was the point. The more ordinary the frames looked, the harder it was to believe 5 murders could have happened without the ordinary movements of the defendant. The pathologists were spare. Asphyxiation for Annalie Alderton, evidence of neck compression for Paula Clennell, findings for Annette Nichols consistent with the same mechanism though the precise cause was less firm, and for Gemma and Tanya, the limits water imposes. No injuries inconsistent with the pattern, nothing to suggest a different narrative. Across all 5, no sexual assault, no defensive wounds that suggested prolonged struggle, a controlled method delivered by someone who kept his scenes clean and his risks low. The Crown didn't pretend to know why. It didn't have to. English law requires who, what, where, when, and with what state of mind. Motive is storytelling. Intent is law. Intent was written, the prosecution said, in 5 acts of asphyxiation, 5 deposits of naked bodies in places chosen for privacy with just enough visibility to get found, 5 disappearances linked to the same tight geography. And intent was reinforced by a forensic web that left no comfortable place for coincidence to live. Wright's account tried to live in that comfort. Through cross-examination and interviews read in, the defense built its alternative. Of course, he was in the red light area. He lived there. Yes, he had paid for sex. That was not a crime. Yes, his car was around. He worked nights at the port of Felixstowe and drove a lot. Yes, fibers can travel. Half the world is made of fibers now. The subtext was simple. This was proximity, not proof. So the Crown shored up its edges. On Tanya, the emphasis fell on car household fiber sets that shouldn't be together and were. On Gemma, a different cluster plus route timing. On Annalie, asphyxiation, pregnancy, and woodland site trace that reappeared where it should not. On Paula, who had been interviewed on camera days before her death, a narrow window in which the defendant's movements and cell site patterning mattered. On Annette, the prosecution leaned hard into constellations, multiple low-level points that by themselves asked questions and together demanded an answer. Jurors listened the way jurors do when the stakes are exact, quietly, heads down, pens moving. They were told how to think about low-template DNA, about random match probabilities, about the limits of inference. They were warned, as they must be, about the dangers of assuming once guilty, guilty of all. And the judge's directions became a tutorial in lawful skepticism. Assess each count separately, each strand carefully, and the totality only at the end. The defense pressed contamination like a bruise. Could technicians have cross-fed fibers? The labs answered. Protocols, separation, audit trails, negative controls. Could the victims have brushed against household items innocently? The police answered. These were not women invited to tea at the defendant's home. The only plausible conduit is the defendant and his car. Could chance have produced the same rare household fiber mix on multiple bodies found miles apart? The statistics said chance shrinks as combinations grow. There were human moments too. Family members gave identifications no one should have to give. Officers who found bodies spoke briefly and then sat down. A scientist admitted that Winter had taken evidence away in places and insisted on telling the jury exactly where the science ended. Honesty about limits sharpened the force of what remained. Closing speeches framed the same puzzle with different morals. The defense asked the jury to guard the gate. Do not convict on atmosphere. Do not confuse familiarity with culpability. Do not let grief do the Crown's arithmetic. The prosecution invited the jury to use the senses the law gives you. Common sense about place and time. Patience for expert testimony that isn't dramatic but is disciplined. The simple question, if not him, who else fits this map this well? And then, the judge gave them the law, folded neatly. What murder requires, how to treat scientific evidence, how to think about circumstantial cases that are strong not because one thing shouts, but because everything points. Deliberations did not drag into weeks. They took long enough to respect the file and short enough to tell you the verdict was not close. The jury returned, guilty of the murders of Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nichols. In the public gallery, the room's breath changed, a release and a weight at once, because guilty doesn't mean restored, it means named. Sentencing was measured and final. The judge spoke to pattern and planning, to vulnerability exploited and lives ended with control and speed, to the impact on families and on a town whose nights still felt thinner. The term was life imprisonment with a whole life order, a recognition that some crimes close the door not just for a long time, but for good. Right was led down. Ipswich went home to a winter that still had to be lived. Outside court statements were brief, as they should be. Police spoke of Operation Sumac with pride that sounded like exhaustion. Families thanked officers and asked for privacy. Advocates reminded cameras that the women at the center of this case had been daughters, sisters, friends, and that speaking about addiction and sex work should never mean speaking with less care. Reporters filed pieces that, for once, kept faith with the facts. Trials don't heal. They order. They put a public truth where rumor used to live and give families a sentence they can say without being corrected. After the verdict, Ipswich began the slow work of being itself again. Stopping at the lights on London Road, walking past Belstead Brook without holding your breath, driving by Levington without checking the mirror twice. The town did not forget. It refused to be frozen. There is one more chapter to tell, the one that lives in afterwards, memorials, lessons for policing and support services, the long fight to keep the victims' names ahead of the man who took them, and the ways a community chose resilience over mythology. But here at the end of the trial, it's enough to hold the legal truth steady. 5 women were hunted and killed. The evidence found the man who did it. And a jury, after being taught how to listen to threads and pixels and timetables, answered for Ipswich with a word that finally fit the weight of that December: guilty. The headlines left town. The satellite trucks folded and drove south on the A12. Court transcripts went into files, and the files went onto shelves. What remained in Ipswich was the ordinary, which is another word for the work after a storm. You could see it first in the way people spoke about the 5 women whose names had filled every living room for a winter. They stopped saying the 5 and started saying names without prompting: Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, Annette Nichols. Friends reminded each other what had been true before December tried to rewrite everything. Tanya was 19, quick and funny, still deciding what kind of adult she wanted to be. Gemma had a way of softening rooms, the sort who remembered your birthday even if she forgot her own appointments. Annalie was pregnant and kept talking about small plans, like paint colors and sandwiches, as if those would anchor her to tomorrow. Paula was honest on camera, because she was honest in life, saying she was scared and still going out because fear doesn't pay rent or buy methadone. Annette looked after people by force of habit, the friend who checks you 8 before you leave. Those sentences came back to the front of the story. Memorials grew from quiet decisions. Someone took flowers to Belstead Brook and found others already there. A small community of color among reeds and winter mud. A wooden cross appeared by a hedgerow near Levington and gathered ribbons the wind couldn't quite take. Church doors stayed open a little later, candles left to burn down on their own. Private places learned to hold public grief with good manners. No speeches, just space. The town also decided to tell the story differently. Reporters love nicknames that travel, but people here learned to flinch at anything that tried to turn a string of crimes into a brand. Families and advocates pressed for language that led with the women rather than the man who took them. Over time, coverage softened in the right direction. Less mythology about a predator shaped by darkness, more clarity about 5 lives, and a police team that refused to blink. It wasn't perfect. It was better. Policing changed, not only in Ipswich, but anywhere that saw itself in Ipswich's mirror. Operation Sumac had already shown what a surge looks like when it's aimed and disciplined, how you put uniform on the pavement and plainclothes in the corners, how you make a control room work like a brain, how you move evidence from field to lab without breaking its voice. After the case, the lessons crystallized. Nighttime economies got new maps. Patrols learned not just where to go, but how to be seen. Visible enough to deter, discreet enough to be told things that matter. The routine use of ANPR and local CCTV matured from a collection of cameras into a grid that could answer questions in hours, not weeks. Officers who would never work a murder still learned how to preserve scenes and conversation alike, because the first minutes after any incident decide what the next year of a case can prove. Partnerships tightened. Support services that had been hanging on by threads, health vans, harm reduction clinics, outreach teams, found steadier footing because everyone understood that safety is not a single uniform on a corner. It is a web stretched across a city. Practically, that looked like phones handed out on cold nights, lifts to warm places, route checks done by workers who know every step and story on London Road. The message to people in the sex trade was not, "You are on your own." It was, "We want you alive tomorrow." That is not approval. It is human arithmetic. Some of the old habits ended. The red light area that had been an open secret became, for a long time, a place where police did not tolerate curb crawling at all. Residents who had spent years blinking at headlights learned to call things in and keep calling until the headlights stopped. Shops adjusted their closing routines. Security cameras were repositioned. Taxis were told what not to do and where not to stop. None of it made the papers. It added up anyway. The case also rewired how investigations spoke to the public. Suffolk officers practiced fronting cameras without turning updates into theater. Steady faces, specific asks, clear refusals to speculate. When the internet tried to guess, detectives put borders around rumor with new briefings. Media learned, slower than anyone liked, to ask better questions and to sit with answers that were not dramatic. Communities learned to measure success by what did not happen. No more disappearances. No more mornings broken by blue light flickering over hedgerows. It is hard to sell nothing happening. It is worth aiming for. There were formal lessons too, written in the precise language forces use when they teach each other. How to scale an incident room without eating your own attention. How to merge intelligence from vice, traffic, neighborhood teams, and the lab so that an arrest is not just quick, but durable. How to deliver victim notification in a way that leaves families with a record they can return to without having to relive the worst minute of their lives. How to hold a line between empathy and promise you cannot keep. Those memos will never be famous. They are the better legacy of a bad winter. The families did the brave, exhausting work no one can teach. They grieved in public enough to keep their daughters visible, and in private enough to stay whole. Some spoke on anniversaries and then chose silence. Some built small charities in their names. Some guarded memory in kitchens and gardens, and never told a camera anything, because not telling is also a right. You could see the shape of love in the choices either way. For people who had sold sex to survive, the aftermath cut two ways. The fear of December made it easier to step away for some. It hardened the need for others. Addiction and poverty do not respect civic resolve. The services that had grown stronger stayed present, and new ones arrived. They offered more than leaflets, real beds, actual treatment, routes into work that paid safely. The lesson was adult. If you want a city to be safer, you have to make the margins less desperate. When the trial transcripts gathered dust, one part of the case stayed bright: the science. Forensic teams presented at conferences and then went back to work with the same calm they'd used in the lab. The point was not to boast. It was to show others how to knit a case from hundreds of quiet tests. No case that relies on biology alone will ever feel as clean as television pretends. But Ipswich proved that fibers, when handled with discipline and skepticism, can do what fingerprints used to do: place a person in a narrative they cannot talk themselves out of. Years on, the sites have gone back to being sites. Belstead Brook is just water with its own green patience. The laybys near Levington are places where drivers stretch their legs and do not know they are standing on ground that held a town's fear for weeks. London Road is busy in the way main roads are, full of children tugging parents, parents tugging shopping bags, buses trying not to be late. This is not erasure. It is how places heal. The people who remember can carry memory so that others don't have to. If you are looking for meaning you can keep in one hand, it is this: the women at the center of this case mattered, and they still matter. A police operation listened to the evidence more closely than to fear, and it worked. A jury learned enough science to say guilty with confidence. A community decided to resist sensationalism and to make practical changes that saved lives no one will ever count, because saved lives don't become headlines. That is a victory, quiet and complete. Say the names again. Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, Annette Nichols. Let them be the first and last words in the story. Let the man who took them occupy the middle, necessary but unglorified. Let Ipswich be remembered not for a nickname, but for a choice, to keep faith with the people it lost by living carefully and kindly in the years after, and by teaching others how to do the same. If you want true cases told without sensationalism, with the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Tanya Nicole, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nichols. Share responsibly. Your support helps us keep making careful, respectful storytelling.